Tiny in All That Air, the Philip Larkin Society podcast.
Hello and welcome to Tiny in All That Air, the Philip Larkin Society podcast. Today we speak to Philip Pullen. Phil is a trustee of the Philip Larkin Society and, like Larkin, was born in Coventry. He is currently the chair of the preparations for the Larkin 100 celebrations being planned by the Society for 2022. Here he talks to us about his extensive research into Larkin's life, which has uncovered so many fascinating news stories about Larkin and his family. He also talks to us about his plans for Larkin 100. I don't personally know very much about your sort of background, right, and how you first became interested in Larkin.
Yeah, well, I was thinking, because I knew that would be something you'd want to ask about in terms of where did Larkin first come into my life. And in some senses, I suppose I feel he's always been there, even if it's just hidden in the background. But, you know, one connection I've got between him and me is that we were both born in Coventry. Mm. I was born in Coventry and brought up in Coventry, left there when I went to university. And I suppose I'd always been interested in poetry. I was aware of Larkin as being a Coventry poet, because there aren't many that are well known, or certainly in terms of the poets I was looking at, that you could associate with Coventry in that way. But I think I came to him a bit later than I'd come to other poets in terms of focusing in on him. And I suppose one of the things that made me interested in him is that he had left so much behind him, particularly in the archive. And I've always been quite interested in archives, and discovering that there was a huge one for Larkin gave me a sort of way in to finding out more about him.
And what part of the archives did you first encounter then?
Well, it in a sense it was really through his mother, because I was coming up to retirement in 2011, and I had a job that meant that I was working in London most weeks of the year, and always on my walk to work I passed the British Library, and I had this feeling that I joined the British Library so I could go into this incredible building, and I thought, well, I want to do something research based when I retire. I want to focus on some topic that I can spend my time looking at. And I actually didn't think about Larkin first of all, because I thought probably everything's been said about him, been done on him really, and I'd read the biographies and all the other stuff about him. I thought, well, what is there left? Then I thought a bit more about the family, and I thought in particular about his mother, of which there is less in the biographies. And I thought, well, maybe there is something really that would be quite interesting to look at in terms of her and her relationship to him. And that's really how I discovered the archives, when I found the archives were in Hull. So I took myself over to Hull and had a first look at them and discovered there was actually quite a lot about his mother in the archives. And that started an interest in wanting to do more research about him and his relationship to his mother.
So that's interesting. So you had those two sort of strands. You had the kind of growing up with that Coventry connection.
Yes.
And then a kind of research focus. So you weren't a member of the society at that point then?
I was a member of the society at that point, but I wasn't a very active member in the society. I think it was more or less about that time when I joined the committee. And I joined the committee partly because I was working on the archives, and it made a useful link for me to be involved with the society. Because, as you know, quite a lot of the archives in there are things which belong to the society that they purchased after Monica Jones died in 2001. So I think it enabled me to have a more of a connection with those around who were themselves interested in Larkin, and knew a lot about what I was interested in from that perspective.
And is that mainly letters then? The letters that they wrote?
Yes, it started off with the letters, because It was her letters I discovered first of all, actually, because they were already catalogued, most of them. So I started to work my way through that. And that was drawing quite a few connections to Coventry as well, because she was writing about things in those letters that I was familiar with from, my time in the city and so on. But I couldn't find his letters to her. And the reason I couldn't find his letters to her is because they had yet to be catalogued. So that gave me a sort of a new sort of input into the archives, really, because I volunteered myself to help with the preliminary cataloguing, which gave me access to, if you like, both sides of the conversation, and it opened up from there. But it isn't just the letters. There are lots of other items in the archives which are personal to him or personal to her, as well as the letters, which help to round out the life, I think.
So what other kind of items are there that belong to Eva then?
Well, one of the most interesting things, which came along a bit later, it took a while before we could access this because it needed to be digitised, but there is an incredible tape recording that Larkin made with his mother in 1961 when she came to stay in Hull. And they sat down in his flat in Pearson Park and had a conversation. And it was fascinating to listen to that because it gave a clue to aspects of their life together in Coventry, for example. It told us quite a lot about how she came to meet Sidney Larkin, the full story. And I think also listening to it, it gives you a flavour of what the relationship was like between Philip and his mother in terms of the closeness of that relationship. It's quite an interesting conversation in that sense. It always reminded me of the Radio 4 programme. Is it called the Listening Programme?
Oh, the Listening Project.
Project, yes, where you have conversations between people that are just going on and being listened into, really. And when I heard it for the first time, it sounded very much like that kind of conversation. And Larkin turned out to be a very good interviewer. Initially, at the beginning of the conversation, he sounds pretty bored. But as he gets into it, he engages with his mother. They have a drink or two. You can hear the glasses tinkling away, but it seems to kind of loosen him up a bit. And so that's one of the things in there that really allows, for example, Eva's voice to be heard for the first time, because I think in many respects it isn't in either the biographies or, for that matter, what Larkin wrote himself about his parents.
And what year was that?
That was 1961.
Okay.
It was quite a significant year for Larkin because a few months earlier he'd collapsed at a library committee meeting, and it was always been unclear as to what made him collapse, and he had various tests, and went into hospital in London and so on. And I think that recording was made around about April of that year, April or May, sometime like that. And he was still recuperating to some degree, I think.
And did he record anybody else? Was that something that he did?
He did. Well, he did, because he had a tape recording, a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and he recorded himself reading poetry. There are recordings of him and Monica Jones reading poetry and plays. And there are other recordings where he's just simply recorded a program off the radio as well. So, I suppose that era, the 1960s, home tape recorders were coming into fashion, and he enjoyed playing around with one, I think.
That's fascinating. So, what other items were there then?
Photographs is another big one, I think. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photographs in the archive. Photographs that Larkin took himself, photographs that the family took. And I've started to unpick some of the ones that really hadn't been seen before because they've been hidden away in the corner of the archive or perhaps neglected, which are as much as anything to do with Eva's family and Eva's background. So it takes us right back into the early parts of the last century, and all of the things that surrounded her at the time when she met Sidney and before that, actually. So there's a whole realm of photographic material that is worth looking at. More recently, I've been focusing on what I suppose you could really call holiday snaps that were taken right back to about the time when Larkin was around 5 or 6, and they started the series of family holidays across various parts of England, mainly the south coast of England. Then they had one final complete family holiday, disastrously, probably in some respects, on the north coast, just outside of Scarborough, at a holiday camp, which was a new kind of experience for them.
Was that kind of typical kind of middle class family behaviour?
Yeah, I would say it was.
Yeah,
I think it was actually. If you look at the way they travelled, the length of holidays they took in the summer, which would always be a fortnight's holiday. They always travelled by train. The Larkins never had a car, which I thought was quite interesting, given that Sydney was in a pretty prominent position as a city treasurer in Coventry, and I assume could afford a car. He never had one. So they travelled by train. But I suppose one of the things that does indicate their sort of privileged position, if you like, as wealthy members of the middle class, is that the holidays they took in Germany, and Larkin went on 2 holidays in Germany in the 1930s, one with both his parents and one with his father, and they flew.
Oh, okay, yeah.
They flew across to, I think it was to Brussels, and this is the point when commercial flight was only really in its infancy and would have cost a fair amount of money, I would think.
And he kept that pattern of going on these very British holidays, didn't he?
He did, yes. It's one of those things, was like a lot of things in his life, he would resent the notion of having to go on holiday. But nevertheless, it was part of the yearly round for Larkin. Most summers, when his mother became widowed in 1948, after that he would dutifully take his mother on holiday almost every year for a week or so in the summer, and then for another time he'd be on holiday with Monica. And yeah, some of those holidays were again taken along the south coast. A lot of them were taken in Scotland. That was a place that he particularly liked going to. Another place was Sark in the Channel Islands. They had a liking for a week or so in Sark. Summer holidays were certainly part of Larkin's general pattern of summer experiences, I guess.
So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the New Eyes Each Year exhibition. Did that have quite a link with the research that you were already doing? Did you find it kind of... I
think it did, really. I think one of the really invaluable things about that is what we drew out of the archives. I mean, that was an exhibition that was held at the University in Hull in 2017, curated by Anna Farthing, who did a brilliant job on it. And it was very much about looking at Larkin in new ways, really, creative ways, focusing on the various possessions in his life, personal possessions, things like the clothes he wore, the letters. We've already talked about the letters that he wrote. He wrote thousands of letters, and they're all in the archives. The drawings, the little doodles he made, the kind of music he listened to, the films he watched and made himself. Actually, one film I particularly remember being in there was the film that they made of the library when the new library was being built just after Larkin had moved to Hull in 1955. But most significantly, in a way, at the centre of the exhibition was Larkin's own library, i.e. the library that he had in his house, which we brought out into the library in the university. And I think that was one of the things which had interested people most about that, because you would wander around essentially these library shelves and discover that many of the books that Larkin had, you might yourself have, because he had a vast range of interests, not just literary interests, but books on cricket, books on various kinds of music, popular fiction, Agatha Christie. There were a lot of Agatha Christie books in there, from what I remember. And,
yeah, he liked crime fiction, didn't he?
He did. Dick Francis, the person who wrote about horse racing, thrillers about horse racing and so on. So, yes, I think the research that I've been carried out was really helpful in that respect, because we were taking out some of these objects for the first time and literally just opening up Larkin, really, and Larkin's identity and his concept of self and how he saw himself through the objects that he surrounded himself with in his life.
And they have an interesting sort of balance with the poetry, and I think the colour of Larkin's items in his clothing and his letters, because he loved writing on different coloured paper.
He did,
didn't he?
Yes. I think the overwhelming colour that was in that exhibition was pink. Because pink was one of his favourite colours, and so if you recall that, there was a lot of pink around the shelves, I think, and we had all these bookends which had got quotes on them from Larkin. They were all pink. It was certainly a very colourful exhibition in that sense. Yes.
Yeah, I like the pink because, we've got the pink on the website, and there's quite a lot of pink in our merchandise now. And I think it's really great to show Larkin as a colourful person, because there is a kind of stereotype of Larkin as a little bit black and white.
Very much so. I think, one of the things which was very successful about that exhibition, and from my mind, it was one of the best exhibitions of Larkin there's ever been, was that we were able to present him in a different light that didn't hide any real element of him, really. I mean, if you wanted to find anything about Larkin, you probably would have found it there. You found his poetry, you found his personal life and the complications within that. You found the sort of completely rounded person. You found a person who had doubts about himself, worried about things, cared about things, anything that you might want to pick up in as a sort of element of his life, and the different compartments within it were all there. And I think what it allowed people to do when they came and visited the exhibition was that they could see him in a different light, but also sometimes see themselves in a different light, or see an aspect of themselves reflected in the person that was being, in a sense, exposed in front of them, opened up for them to see the various parts of his life that normally would have been kept very secret or very personal in that sense.
Yes, it's interesting with that journey, because with the Andrew Motion biography, there was this kind of national outcry, and suddenly Larkin was this kind of terrible figure, it seemed. Yeah. But now I think, in a way, when you look back on that was a good thing that happened, because there's nothing else, you can't be shocked by things that he does and says, and we've gradually learned the context of the things that he wrote in the letters, etc., that people perhaps found shocking when they first read them. And we see him as a whole person now. I
think the context is really important. At one level, just to bear in mind that some of the things that certainly we would find shocking about what Larkin said, or what Larkin seemed to believe, or how he referred to people, some of those things are very shocking, and in terms of the culture of today, very unacceptable. Yeah. But to some degree, at least, we might just have to recall that he didn't intend many of those things to be out in the public. There were very much things said to individuals, there were very much things written in letters which were not intended, one can assume, for to be in an exhibition at the end of the day. It's not to excuse anything, it's just to make it clear that there is a context to that. And I think the other thing about it is that it generated the sorts of discussions we should be having about that. That it was never in Anna's intention to put Larkin on a pedestal, anything but that, but to actually look at him, if you like, warts and all, so that, people could then respond to that and think about their own lives in that context and so on. I think one of the really valuable things about the exhibition in that sense is at the very end of it, when you got to the last stage of the exhibition, you were faced by some tables and some writing materials and this big heading "Dear Philip" on it, and visitors were invited to write their own letter to Larkin, which I thought was a great thing to do. And we had a vast range of responses to that. All sorts of things. Sometimes people who'd known him in their lives, because we had a lot of people visiting the exhibition who'd been students at the university when Larkin was the librarian, for example, and they were writing something quite personal about themselves in that sense. And an incredible range of things that, looking at his life, sparked off in them. And I think that was one of the things I'll take away from the exhibition as being one of the really successful things, because it did make people think, it did make people reflect about their lives as much as his.
Yeah, and where did those letters go? What did you do with those?
We've kept them all, and I believe they're going to go into the History Centre in Hull, into the Larkin archive. I mean, it would be great if we could do something more with them. We could publish them in some way or other. Maybe that's something to think about as we move towards Larkin Centenary, because there are some really interesting reflections on Larkin that are contained within them.
It's amazing how much writing he stimulates, Philip Larkin, how much
Absolutely.
He's discussed in the press. He's a touchstone for so many news articles. His name is like invoked all the time.
It is, yeah. But I was kind of stood back from that only the other day, actually, because one of the things that we were thinking about in that exhibition, and I think we're going to think about even more as we move to other things that we would like to do in exhibiting Larkin and doing projects around Larkin, is how do you associate Larkin with younger audiences? I came across a quote from Andrew Hagen the other day in a London Review of Books, where he said, "If you are British and no longer young, the title for a brand new Philip Larkin poem is liable to enter your head at least once a day." And I think, yes, that's true, actually, in that sense. But what about if you are young, as it were? What about if you're not British, or you take a different sort of cultural stance from others who might be sort of being seen as a mainstream Larkin audience? I mean, yes, he does crop up everywhere, almost every day, but I think, certainly there's an interesting challenge about how, what's the relevance of Larkin today to today's young people, for example. It's something that I've been thinking about recently.
Yeah, well, that is interesting. And when I've taught sixth formers and taught students, they do find the world of Larkin quite alien, that world of the kind of bachelor male in the 1950s, 1960s, and rented rooms, and the whole world of the university is very different from how universities operate today.
Sure.
Even just the role of the librarian, and the status of the librarian, it's something that isn't something that students would be aware of in a modern academic library.
No.
You wouldn't know who your librarian was in your academic library today.
Yeah.
And I know one of the first times I taught Larkin at A-level, it was comparative with T.S. Eliot. And they got the wasteland. They were able to sort of get symbolism and mythology.
Yeah.
They seemed very confident with that. And maybe because it's very... But they found something about Larkin even more mystical in a way, even more mysterious. Which was
I can see that, because in some ways he's talking about a lost world in the ways that you just exemplified, I suppose. But then again, that can be a starting point for saying, well, look, libraries aren't like that anymore. What's the difference? What's happened? But I think on the other hand, if you take some of the things, Larkin's very famous, isn't he, for one poem, in a way, on about what your parents do to you. And I don't think the relevance of that poem is any different now from what it was when he wrote it. And if you delve into some of the things, for example, that he writes about his parents, it's actually quite complicated, and some of it is quite contradictory as well. And you can go into some of that stuff and say, well, actually, what Larkin was talking about his parents, for example, when he was a teenager, writing to his friend Jim Sutton about what was happening in his house in Warwick or in Coventry, whichever one it was, and complaining about his parents. I don't think it's a million miles away from what you might feel nowadays about your parents sometimes. There are things which are universal in Larkin as well that you can engage with.
Yeah, definitely. I love it in reference back, where his mum's shouting up the stairs.
Yes.
Yeah, that was a nice one. And I can think of when my mum tried to engage in the music that I listened to when I was a teenager.
Absolutely.
And how it gives you those mixed feelings, and
yes, definitely. And
I know that this is an area that you're looking to explore, hopefully, in Coventry for the Larkin 100 projects.
Yes, I mean, that's something which is beginning to exercise us now, because 2022 will be the centenary of Larkin's birth. And I think that's a tremendous opportunity to do something very significant about Larkin, not just in one place, but across the country. I mean, building up really from the fact that, as you say, you can read something almost every day that's a reference to Larkin, that he's around there to be used. But before we get to what might happen in 2022, there's something really important happening in his home city of Coventry in 2021, insofar as Coventry will be City of Culture, taking over that mantle from Hull. We did something very significant with Larkin in 2017 in Hull in terms of the New Eyes Each Year exhibition. And Larkin was very prominent in the whole of the process of bidding to be City of Culture. Coventry's taking a very different approach, I think, from what I've heard so far about what it wants to do in its year as City of Culture. And the demographics of Coventry are different in some respects from Hull. It's certainly got a younger demographic. That's one of the things that is very much being emphasised, that the average age of the population is around about 32 as opposed to, I think, 40 nationally. So their focus is likely to be different from what happened in Hull before. And I suppose one of the challenges in saying, well, okay, you've got somebody culturally very significant in Philip Larkin in terms of, the literary output, the literary significance of this person born and brought up in Coventry. But how are you going to make him relevant to what it's like to be living in the city today? And I think that's very much what we have in mind for what might happen in Coventry, which is why I'm interested in Larkin, if you like, Larkin the teenager as an aspect of that, and whether there are ways in which we could look at his experience of the city, which is in some ways in a very different situation from how the city is today. In other ways, they're probably the same. How can we look at that in a way that will engage today's population in the city? And I think that's a really exciting challenge, actually.
Yeah, I think you're right. It will be so interesting to look at him as a teenager, and it addresses that whole sort of issue about Larkin being perceived as sort of turning his back on Coventry and rejecting Coventry. And actually, he lived his formative years, those young formative years there.
He did.
And I think it's really a really lovely opportunity to let Coventry reclaim Larkin, a little bit back from Hull.
I think so, but because I'm not sure. I mean, we know that in Hull, certainly before we had the Toads, as they were calling it, or before we had the celebrations around Larkin 25, the celebration of the 25 years after Larkin had died, I think awareness of Philip Larkin and views on Philip Larkin were not always positive, shall we say. But once we got started on that year of celebration and the Toads, which were then sort of found and still are found in various parts of Hull, it changed the focus. And I'm hoping that something like that will happen for Coventry too.
Yeah, of course, when Larkin was at university, that was when Coventry was being bombed, wasn't it?
Yes.
And I know in Jill, the character in there, when he describes going back to Coventry, doesn't he?
Which is exactly what Larkin did, yes.
Yeah, and, not knowing what he was going to find and, walking around the sort of, destroyed areas.
Yes, and indeed, after the war, I mean, you're right to say that Larkin, didn't forget Coventry after that time. I mean, he might have claimed to do in some ways, in his childhood being a forgotten ward, and poetically at least, he did actually make visits back to Coventry, either with his mother or on his own. And there are some fascinating photographs, for example, in the archive of the ruined old cathedral in Coventry and the building of the new one. There's one in particular where Larkin's clearly gone up the tower of the old cathedral, and he's got this incredible photograph of the scaffolding on the new one as it's rising. And he also attended, I think, his niece's graduation from Warwick University, the new Coventry Cathedral, and I think he also was awarded a D.Litt in the new cathedral.
And the society, I know yourself, you have links with Larkin's school in Coventry.
King Henry VIII, yes. Yeah, they're keen on having some kind of exhibition, I think, in 2021. And they got their own archive, obviously school archive, which contains some elements of Larkin's time at the school, which they will want to promote.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as a society, we've also in the past been involved in seminars and various events at the school, which has been great to go to the school where Larkin went.
No, it's great. I think it's really good. We've kept those links with the school. I think it's excellent. And I know you're at the early stages of planning, really, what's going to happen in Coventry, but I think it's very exciting. And of course, we've got the Mechanicals as well that are involved as a Coventry-based...
Yes, that's been a great link, actually. A Coventry-based band who are working on Larkin's poems and putting... I mean, Larkin's poems have been put to music before, but this is a really new stance on it. And then they're also linking in with dramas so that you've got this coming together of enactment of parts of Larkin's life, relationships with this incredible music background to that, jazz in particular. They're still working this up, but as you know, I think you've already talked to Wes Finch from the Mechanicals, haven't you?
Yeah.
They performed what they've done so far in Hull, and I went to see it in Hull. I also went to see it in Coventry. And it went down really well on both occasions, and we were really excited by that, and how this opens up, I think, new possibilities for ways of looking at Larkin and the ways that I've said. How will you engage new audiences? This is one of the ways that you can do it, I think. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, just to bring all that, the visual side and the music and the words as lyrics. It's a really lovely way of exhibiting Larkin, isn't it, and giving a voice to Larkin.
Yeah, and I think you realise just how easy, in some ways, how easy these poems lend themselves to music. Considering that there was only one poem that he wrote that was intended to have a musical score attached to it, which was Bridge for the Living.
Yeah.
So, the piece that he wrote for the celebration of the opening of the Humber Bridge. But it's so many of his poems lend themselves to that musical interpretation.
Yeah,
and various forms as well. I mean, in the past there's been sort of more of a classical emphasis on how you put Larkin's poetry to music. So you can work in lots of different musical styles as well, which I think is great.
Yeah, and they've got that slight mixture of styles, haven't they? They've got a kind of folk element and a jazz element.
And a more classical feel as well.
Yeah, they're incredibly talented.
They're very talented, I mean, they're so excited about what else we might be doing in the future in terms of that kind of thing. And I think all of that gives us a kind of input into what Coventry will be doing in 2021. But, we see that as if anything, a stepping stone to something that would be much bigger and effectively more global in the following year. What we'd like to do is to engage in particular ways so that we can get something happening around Larkin throughout the year of 2022 and across the country, really, across the British Isles at the very least.
And that's going to be an amazing project.
I think so. I hope so. Anyway, I mean, it's early days for that as well, but we hope it's going to, they're going to be ways in which people will think, well, yes, actually, Larkin has a connection here or there, and we could be involved in this.
Yeah.
Whether it's on a local basis or whether there's some kind of national focus that we can have.
Yeah, and you've already had expressions of interest from people across the country, and hopefully, more people will get involved and come forward and suggest ideas of what we can do in Larkin 100 in 2022. It's going to be a really fascinating year.
Well, I hope so, because I think we've decided on a theme that should enable that to happen, because what we've thought about in terms of the year is to focus on place. I mean, you could have lots of discussions about place and how it fitted into Larkin's poetry or didn't fit into it, but just in terms of thinking about the places that are associated with Larkin's life, you can open up so many possibilities. At one level, you can look at the places that he lived in, the significant places, like we already said, Coventry, where he was born and brought up, the places he worked in, Wellington, the very first job he had as a public librarian in Wellington in Shropshire, Leicester and Belfast and Hull are all places which are significant because he spent a large amount of time living there. But there are also places that he visited, either on a one-off or went on holiday to, or what have you, that you, again, have got some very distinctive connections with his life, either because while he was there he wrote a poem, or it generated a poem in him, like, for example, Chichester and the Arundel Tomb, for example, as one place where he visited and where a poem came out of it, or somewhere he went with somebody significant in his life. The holidays he took with his mother, or the journeys he took with his mother, the journeys he took with his father to Germany, an interesting one, and with Monica Jones or with Maeve Brennan or all the other people in his life. There are lots of things that you can focus around a place that we're hoping would be a way of sustaining this across the year.
Yeah, I think that would be really interesting, and it'd be nice for people to learn, to find out what Larkin did in their town or on their local beach, or
well, I think
the local pubs. And
that for me is a really interesting thing, because I think there are bound to be places which don't even know they have a Larkin connection. Because it's not been something that has come out in discussions, or it's been forgotten about in somewhere or other, or it's hidden away in the letters or the stuff that people haven't read. So I think there'll be some surprises, actually, in terms of people's awareness of how much time Larkin spent in a certain place.
Yeah.
I mean, an example might be Loughborough, where he visited his mother on a fairly regular basis and knew the town very well, but I'm not sure that many people in Loughborough are aware of that, or aware that happened.
And there we leave Philip Pullen. Thank you so much, Phil, for your generous time and support with the podcast. If you'd like to get involved with Larkin 100, please contact the Society via larkin100@philiplarkin.com. We would love to hear your ideas for events commemorating Larkin right across the country. Please follow the podcast on Twitter @tiny_air and head to the website philiplarkin.com if you'd like to buy some merchandise, make a donation, or even become a Society member. Quick shout out to some Twitter followers: Ian McPhee, Ships in the Sky, Claire O'Callaghan, Paul Whitfield, and thank you to our new Society member, Mark Anthony Owen, for tweeting about his new membership. Tiny and All That Air is produced by Simon Galloway, with the music provided by The Mechanicals. Please get in touch with ideas for podcasts, or if you'd like to be a guest yourself.
The horns of the morning are blowing, are shining. The meadow is wet with the coldest of dew. The dawn reassembles.